Hello and welcome to Heilman Haver, the Stage and Screen Podcast, episode 28, coming to you virtually from Casa de Quinn and 1111 Studios in beautiful Port Orchard, Washington. I'm Matt Haver.
And I'm Greg Heilman. We're two local actors looking to hone our craft by exploring the best in local theater and on the big screen. Each week we bring you entertainment, news, and views, celebrate classic Hollywood, enjoy cocktails with a Tinseltown twist, interview talented local actors and directors, and chat with industry experts from LA to the UK.
We hope you all had a chance to join us on YouTube last week as we celebrated the birthday of Audrey Hepburn with a special In the Mix at the Bay Street Bistro, dedicated to Audrey's first starring role and first Oscar win, Roman Holiday, co-starring Gregory Peck. Dalton Trumbo wrote Peck's role with Cary Grant in mind, but Grant and Hepburn wouldn't make a film together until 1963's Charade, 10 years later.
And despite only appearing in one film together, they shared a special friendship. Hepburn said of Grant, "I had this great affection for him because I knew he understood me. It was an unspoken friendship which was wonderful. He would open up his arms wide when he saw you and hug you and smile and let you know how he felt about you."
Cary Grant understood Hepburn, but did he understand himself? The man born Archibald Leach is one of the most revered and adored actors and leading men in the 20th century, yet he spent decades creating and maintaining the brilliant disguise that was Cary Grant. Our guest today is the best-selling author of the new biography, Cary Grant, A Brilliant Disguise, Scott Eyman.
Scott is the author or co-author of 15 books, including biographies of John Wayne, Cecil B. DeMille, Louis B. Mayer, John Ford, and Henry Fonda, and James Stewart. According to Douglas K. Daniel of the Associated Press, Eyman's new book is, quote, the most entertaining and enlightening star biography in years. And Louis Bayard of the Washington Post called it an estimable and empathetic biography. And Scott joins us now from his home in West Palm Beach, Florida.
Scott, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, welcome to the show.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, Scott, I found a phrase in your introduction that seemed to encapsulate the theme of your book and my understanding of Archie Leach's transformation into Cary Grant really well. You said his specific genius was to project a consistent image of style and grace with a little something extra. So he certainly accomplished the former. He was the epitome of Hollywood gentleman. But what about that quote-unquote little something extra? What is and continues to be so magnetic and interesting about Cary Grant?
Well, when he plays drama, I think there's always an element of irony present. And when he plays comedy, there's always an element of desperation present. There's always a counterbalance to what the prevailing tone of the piece is. He's never just one thing. He's not projecting just one thing. There are overtones and there are undertones in the best Cary Grant movies. And it doesn't have anything to do with the script. It's not necessarily the way it's written, the way the character's written. It's the way the character's played. And he understood that an actor is an independent contractor. And the dialogue is one thing, but what an actor projects has to be more than just saying the dialogue and hitting the marks. And I think that's what people respond to, because he seems, on the one hand, he's got classic good looks of that era of Hollywood, where everybody was good looking, basically. If you weren't good looking, you were a character actor. All the stars were great looking. On the one hand, he's great looking. On the other hand, he seems very modern because of his ability to shift in between dark notes and light notes.
Yeah, I was watching a few months ago, I watched North by Northwest, and I remember wondering or asking myself, what is it about Cary Grant that makes him so special? What is it about him that makes him special to me? And I started to think, and during, to your point, during his career, there was no shortage of masculinity in Hollywood. I mean, good-looking guys. There was a lot of kind of these, masculine, kind of strong men, and almost a dime a dozen. Every actor handsome, very masculine. So he has a sort of, I guess, self-deprecating humility, humor, a sensibility that he brought to his work. And you mentioned in your book that a lot of people, the audience, would see him as a member of their extended family, not just as an actor, which allowed him to get away with certain things in his personal life that other actors might not have. But along the lines of his acting style, and I just watched His Girl Friday the other night as well, and noticed, the improv with, using the Leach name, his real name, as, the guy, he got his throat cut and all of that. But so what do you think helped shape that unique style of acting and that connection that he had to the audience like that? Was it his vaudeville experience? Was it just his innate personality?
No, it wasn't his innate personality. It was incremental. If you look at Cary Grant's early movies from 1932, 33, 34, he's painfully, he doesn't seem to know what to do. He's there. He knows he's good looking, but he doesn't seem to know what to do or how to project or what is expected of him. He's sort of like, I think I describe him as a sort of 8x10 glossy in motion. He's afraid to express anything. Interestingly, I was just a couple of days ago, I came across an interview with Charlie Chaplin from 1966. And they were talking of it was a Q&A, long transcript, and it was a Q&A, and the interviewer brought up acting and getting in touch with personality. And the name Cary Grant comes up, and Chaplin says that refers to how self-conscious he was. And then he said, then he broke through. He says, which happens sometimes. And Chaplin knew exactly what happened in that he figured out something more had to be added to the mix other than just looking 6'2" and gorgeous and looking great in a tux. Something else had to be projected. Otherwise, he was going no place fast. Because even in that era, even an actor as handsome as Clark Gable projected a kind of alley cat masculinity and a good humor, that transcended whatever part he was playing. It was a continuum of, if it wasn't written in the script, Gable would bring it as part of the performance. But that was ongoing from the early 30s to Gable's death with the Misfits. And I think the baseline for Grant's sense of his performance was his physical self-confidence, because he was trained as an acrobat, and he was a professional acrobat and a very high-end professional acrobat. He knew he could trust his body. He could do things with his body that other actors simply can't do, because very few actors have that kind of physical training. So that was the foundation, the cement foundation. And then he got lucky, and he got a part or two that actually demanded he bring something that resonated with his own personal experience of life. In Sylvia Scarlett, directed by George Cukor, and he's got a good director. Cukor is not somebody who just has the actors do what the script tells them to do. Cukor could talk to actors and draw them out and give them a sense of self-confidence, far more than most directors of that period, who were, for the most part, picture shooters. They didn't really work with actors much. Cukor loved working with actors. And Grant's performance in Sylvia Scarlett is that of a kind of a sharper Cockney who's a little bit angry about the position life has put him in, and determined to do better. And at the same time, he's got a level of self-awareness about who he is and what his gifts are. And he knows that there's a certain amount of hustle that he's going to have to apply if he's going to be a success in life. And that directly related to Archie Leach's experience of life. There's an anger there, there's a frustration there, there's a certain class-based consciousness of the fact that he was born with two strikes against him, and that he would have to find a way around that if he was going to be a success in life. And he could access that anger easily because he had a part that actually he could relate to, a character that had similarities to his own character, and a director who would encourage him to bring himself to the part, which other directors hadn't been doing, because there was no similarity between Archie Leach and the parts he'd been playing. They were simply second string Paramount cast-offs that Gary Cooper turned down or that Frederick March turned down. And there's no reason Cary Grant should have been playing parts that Gary Cooper could play or Frederick March could play. But nobody was writing Cary Grant parts until he lucked into Sylvia Scarlett on a loan out to RKO.
You talk about the similarities between Grant and Chaplin in their early lives, the strikes against them, a psychological reference, as you say. They both had detached moms, alcoholic fathers, a kind of an untethered childhood led to a fascination with, the escape of music and film. And it reminded me of Marlon Brando's childhood, as described in his autobio with Robert Lindsay, Songs My Mother Taught Me. In your experience as a biographer, are people like Grant and Brando and Chaplin the exception or the rule for other celebrities you profiled? Is there something inherently or uniquely damaged about most actors that draws them into that profession?
If you spend your life playing people other than yourself, it presupposes a certain dissatisfaction with who you regard as yourself, as your own personality, as your own background. You're looking for alternate lives, alternate personalities to inhabit, even if only on a temporary basis. Now, you could justify it intellectually by saying it gives me a different vantage point to regard the human condition and my own place in the human condition, and help me redefine my strengths and my weaknesses, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But still, the baseline is I need to find somebody else to be, because I'm not particularly satisfied with who I actually am. And I think that there are exceptions. There are numerous exceptions. People who are comfortable in their own skin, actors who are comfortable in their own skin, and they project someone that seems to be like who they actually are. Whether that's who they actually are or not, we don't really know. Their husbands or their wives would know how close that projection is to who they actually are. But they've mastered the art of appearing to be the same person off camera that they appear to be on camera. That doesn't necessarily mean they're that person. So yeah, I think there's a certain aura of wish fulfillment in any show business career that is defined by a personality that is definitively not necessarily the identical personality that people at home see compared to the personality that people in the audience see.
Interesting. One of my favorite stories in your book that I've heard recounted outside of the book as well is a Michael Caine story. It's Michael Caine and Cary Grant standing outside of the Beverly Hills Hotel. A lady walks up to them, recognizes Michael Caine, who, as a side note, Matt and I, huge Michael Caine fans as well. She looks at Michael Caine and said, I've been here for, I think, 2 weeks, and you're the first celebrity I've seen. And she looks over at Cary Grant as if he's just an average person and says, "You just don't see stars in Hollywood, do you?" And he's replied, "No, ma'am, you don't." And this was part of his retirement, and you describe his retirement as being the best of both worlds. He was still famous, and yet he could live his retired life on his own terms. Is that
Right.
something that throughout his life that he wanted to try to maintain control of how people viewed him or what they thought of him, or just that kind of control?
Sure. Look at once he establishes who he is as an actor, he works. There are a few exceptions where he steps outside of that, but there aren't too many exceptions. You can count on one hand, basically. The parts where he leaves Cary Grant behind, None But the Lonely Heart, perhaps Notorious, perhaps Suspicion, a few times. But basically, he colors within the lines for the rest of his career. There's a reason he does that. It's because he found something that the audience wanted to buy. And even though I think he felt occasionally frustrated by his self-imposed limitations, I think he needed that security. He needed the emotional security, because the first basic 30 years of his life, he had no security. He didn't have any emotional security. He didn't have any financial security. It was a very psychological hand-to-mouth existence. And that's a long time to be tap dancing, wondering if you're going to be able to pay the rent, And once he finally found that personality that resonated with the public, he was not about to cast it aside in the pursuit of self-realization. He clung to it the book, I go into some of the parts he turned down. The most famous example, of course, is Norman Maine in the Judy Garland version of The Star Is Born, which he could have played magnificently. He also turned down Harry Lime in The Third Man, which he could have played magnificently. He turned down half a dozen parts that would have made his career an entirely different career than what we're talking about now. Would it have been a better career? Not necessarily. It just would have been a different career. It would have been a more overtly ambitious career. And he turned him down. And there's a reason for that. With Star Is Born, I suspect he didn't want to get involved in the Judy Garland Mishigas, because she had a long history of train wreck productions in back of her and emotional issues. And I don't think he wanted to get anywhere near anybody else's emotional issues. He had enough of his own, and he had enough with his mother. He wanted clarity, in the people he worked with. He wanted relaxation in the people he worked with, and he wanted quiet competence in the people he worked with. That's why he gravitated towards Alfred Hitchcock or Leo McCarey. Directors who kept a fairly light tone on the set, and there was no Sturm und Drang, and there were no raised voices. He didn't want that.
Yeah, you talk about that early in the book with Marlene Dietrich, one of his early projects, where she was just so much chaos.
Yeah. Well, it was Sternberg. Sternberg and Dietrich, that was a psychodrama being played out on a daily basis. And he was completely unprepared for what he walked into. And where Sternberg is very curt. At his best day, he was curt. On his worst day, he was a sadistic SOB. And Grant had no experience of that at all. And I mean, he must have been just, he must have pulled in every antenna he had, just trying to get through it alive, you know? He just wasn't, he was not that guy that was going to enjoy jousting with people on a film set. He loathed working for Michael Curtiz, who was a yeller, you know, and that's why he turned down Billy Wilder every time Wilder asked him to do a film, even films that he could have done easily. He could have played Love in the Afternoon easily. He could have played Sabrina easily. Mm-hmm. He turned down Wilder. He turned down 1, 2, 3. He turned down Billy Wilder every time Wilder offered him a script, not because Wilder was a bastard, but Wilder had sharp elbows. You know, he could be cutting, verbally cutting on a set, and Grant wouldn't get anywhere near that. He just had a horror of confrontation and of emotional aggression.
Well, we love talking to our authors on the show, and 2 weeks ago we had the pleasure of interviewing your friend and ours, Robert Bader. Next week we'll be joined by his wife and our guest from episode 19, Tracy Gossel, to talk about her book, The First King of Hollywood, The Life of Douglas Fairbanks. Now, Grant became friends with the junior Douglas Fairbanks after they appeared in Gunga Din in 1939. But interesting story early in the book, he had an interaction with Douglas Fairbanks Sr. While he was still Archie on his first voyage to the U.S. on a shuffleboard court. Now, Grant became a paragon of fashion and style, and it seems that some of this may have stemmed from Fairbanks. Can you tell us about that interaction and Fairbanks' influence on Grant?
Well, it was 1920. Archie Leach was coming over on the boat, the Olympia, from London to New York to begin his American vaudeville career. He'd already been working in English vaudeville for a couple of years at that point. And he and the troupe were coming over on the Olympia to New York. Also on the boat were Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford coming back from their honeymoon, European honeymoon, which I think had gone on for 6 weeks. And like every other young male around the world, Grant thought Douglas Fairbanks was the bee's knees because he had vivacity. He was physically a marvelous specimen, very muscular, great personality, great joie de vivre, great humor. You couldn't help but love him. Archie found Grant on board, and of course Grant was in the captain's cabin, and Archie was, you know, somewhere in third class. But at one point, Archie did find Fairbanks on the deck and got a picture taken with him and chatted with him for a few minutes. And the picture's in the book of 16-year-old Archie and Doug Fairbanks coming back from his honeymoon. And it's a great photo. And Archie treasured the photo all his life. But what impressed him about Fairbanks was, his approachability, which I might add that when Archie became Cary, he was not the most approachable person.
Yeah.
To the general public. That didn't happen. But Fairbanks was extremely gregarious, and his noblesse oblige, that Fairbanks had absorbed a great deal of social ease and comfort along with success, along with money. It didn't barricade him behind the door. He was perfectly happy to share it with the people whenever he ran into them. And he was also impressed by Fairbanks's clothes. And well into Cary Grant's 80s, he would talk about how Fairbanks dressed, because Fairbanks dressed in English style. Okay, Fairbanks's tailors were all Savile Row. So Archie, growing up in Bristol, Savile Row, it might have has been Monaco as far as he was concerned. He had no knowledge at all of Savile Row fashions except what he saw people wearing. But when he saw Fairbanks, who was short, Fairbanks was about 5'7", but he looked like he was 6 feet. He carried himself like he was 6 feet, and he dressed like a god. He was very impressed by that, and all his life, once he got successful, Cary Grant basically used English tailors. And when he didn't use English tailors, he would have American tailors do knockoffs of English styles. Okay, but it was usually the English cut. He really liked the English cut.
That's interesting. You mentioned the approachability. You referenced that a few times in your book, what Cary Grant thought of autograph seekers and things like that. It was enlightening to see that side of him.
Yeah. He was very. He would ask people to give him $1 for an autograph, and of course people would, because they're not used to that, and they would back off, and that would be what he wanted to do in the first place. I think he was insecure. He could flip on Cary Grant on and off, and people expected him to be what he was on screen, and he could flip that on when he wanted to, but he didn't always want to. Sometimes you just want to go to the store and get a pack of cigarettes. But that's when you're a celebrity on that level. That's the reality. That's the reality. And he didn't have a lot of people around him. He didn't have personal assistants like they have today and all that. Generally, if an actor had to do that sort of thing, they had to go to the store themselves. Or if they had a cook or a chef at the house, the chef would go pick up something they needed along at the grocery store. But, Grant lived a fairly low-key, circumspect life. So going out in public was not easy for him psychologically or practically.
Something that I wonder, and it's the story you tell at the beginning of the book about when he was doing his one-man show, he would get requests for autographs. And instead of autographs, he would actually welcome people to come up to the front of the stage and shake hands. And that seems like even more of a personal thing than just write an autograph quick. You don't even have to make eye contact, bam, and away you go. I wonder if the autograph made him feel cheap or like a commodity, like a product, maybe, because that juxtaposition I found really interesting.
It is interesting. But also you got to remember that it's the difference between when he was an active star and there were just dozens and dozens of demands upon him every day to when he was retired and basically able to pick and choose when he would go out in public and when he would be seen by the public. Those appearances he was making the last 4 or 5 years of his life, he chose to do those because I think they were great reassurance to him that what he had done mattered and that people still cared about what he had done as an actor and what he had accomplished as an actor. Because let's face it, if you're a movie star and you're off the screen, there's another dozen movie stars that come on up because that's the business the movies are in. And some of the people are authentic stars and some of the people have no business being in front of a movie camera. But he did have, but I think doing those shows, and I was at one of those shows. He did one of those appearances in Fort Lauderdale. This was in 1984 or 5. And I went to the show and it was really interesting. He didn't say anything that was particularly revelatory because he got the same questions night after night, who is your favorite leading lady? What's it like to kiss Grace Kelly? Those kinds of questions. And he would answer them with good humor. But it was interesting to see how relaxed he was when relaxation was not a word often used in relation to Cary Grant, except in front of the movie camera. Off camera, he could be a nervous wreck.
Yeah.
But in his retirement, the pressure was off. He didn't have anything left to prove. He didn't have to worry about his money disappearing. He had all the money he could ever spend for another generation, actually. He could relax. The pressure was off. And he could flip Cary Grant on. And that's basically what he gave the audience. But by that time, the performance had become the man to a much greater extent in 1984 or 5 than it had been in 1945, let's say, when it was much more of a performance.
Doing it on his own terms.
Exactly. And he was choosing to do it. And it wasn't about money because most of the money went to charity. He got expenses. It was about reminding the audience and reminding himself how much they meant to each other. And I think he found it very rewarding because I think he was a little leery of the audience for most of his career. And it was only later, in retrospect, thinking about it, that he realized that there was a reciprocal relationship going on and that he had perhaps undervalued all those people who had gone faithfully to see Cary Grant movies for 35 years.
Well, I want to talk a minute about leading ladies. You mentioned Grace Kelly, and Cary Grant was married 5 times, and a lot of times is just associated with various leading ladies that he's had throughout his career. One that comes to mind that I especially enjoyed that I watched a few months ago was Mr. Blandings Builds His Dream House with Myrna Loy. And I thought it was a fun film. I thought the chemistry between the two of them was just fantastic. You quote him, Cary Grant is saying in the book, acting is like playing ball. You toss the ball and some people don't toss it back. Some people don't even catch it. But when you get somebody who catches it and tosses it back, that's really what acting is about, which is what he found with Myrna Loy.
Mm-hmm.
He worked with a great number of leading ladies. I know he was outspoken about his Mae West he wasn't all that fond of. But on the other end of the spectrum, you had, like you mentioned, Grace Kelly,
mm-hmm.
which I think has always been what he said is one of his favorite, if not his favorite leading ladies. Now, considering that he's worked with so many, and the chemistry, except for a few exceptions, was really fantastic. Did he adjust the way he acted, or did he do anything differently depending on who his leading lady or co-star was?
His attitude towards an actress was largely dependent less on their acting and more on what they were as a person. He liked his favorite actress, he always said, was Grace. I don't think she was the best actress he ever worked with, frankly. But he liked her. He liked Grace Kelly because he said she really listened. And if you threw in an ad lib, she could match it and not turn to the director and said, that's not in the script. That's what drove him up the wall. And she had no particular airs about her as a person. She just showed up, and then when she went into makeup and came out as Grace Kelly. He loved Ingrid Bergman for the same reason. Ingrid Bergman would come in to the studio with her hair tied back with a shoelace, and she'd put the costume on, and they'd do the hair, and she'd come out, and she was Ingrid Bergman. But that's not who she was. She was all about the seriousness of the work. She was a serious actress, and he respected that. So his response to them as actors, he wanted them to be more women than actors, I think, in his head.
Our guest today is best-selling author Scott Eyman. Coming up, we'll hear more about Scott's journey as a journalist and author and his other biographies of famous actors and directors from the golden age of Hollywood. We'll be right back on Heilman and Haver.
Welcome back to Heilman and Haver. Today is May 14th, the birthday of both George Lucas and Robert Zemeckis. The two men were classmates at the University of Southern California School of Cinema and gained renown as directors, producers, and screenwriters. Zemeckis best known for Back to the Future and Forrest Gump, and Lucas for Indiana Jones and a little franchise called Star Wars.
Well, if you want to be the next Robert Zemeckis or George Lucas, or have aspirations in this realm, don't miss your chance to enter the 2021 West Sound Film Festival taking place August 5th through 8th. Submissions are open now and will be accepted through the end of June. For more information and to submit your project, visit westsoundfilmfestival.com and stay tuned right here for festival news and interviews.
Well, our guest today knows a thing or two about filmmakers. Scott Eyman is the author or co-author of 15 books, with a new book due out this fall. And these include Empire of Dreams, The Epic Life of Cecil B. DeMille, Lion of Hollywood, The Life and Legend of Louis B. Mayer, and Print the Legend, The Life and Times of John Ford.
Scott also penned the bestseller John Wayne, and with actor Robert Wagner, the bestsellers Pieces of My Heart and You Must Remember This. He also wrote Hank and Jim, the 50-year friendship of Henry Fonda and James Stewart, and our subject in segment 1, Cary Grant, A Brilliant Disguise.
Scott was formerly the literary critic at the Palm Beach Post, writes book reviews for the Wall Street Journal, and has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Chicago Tribune.
So, Scott, you've written about the lives and careers of some of the biggest names from the golden age of Hollywood. Matt and I are big fans of many of your subjects, like Cary Grant, Jimmy Stewart, John Wayne. There's a certain mystique about that era of show business that keeps drawing us back to it, and so many others. With so many biographies written about many of these great talents, how do you choose to pursue a project? Is it personal interest? Is there something else that drives which projects you take on?
Well, it's someone I have to be interested in. And to be perfectly frank, it's someone that I have to feel hasn't been done justice in previous books. I mean, by this time in 2021, every first-ranked movie star of that era has had a book written about them. And I've almost certainly read that book. And I mean, there's also has to be of personal contact in terms of what about them interests me. I don't do, especially, now at my age, I don't take on assignments. I remember Kevin Brownlow. I was flouncing around for a subject, and Kevin Brownlow said out of nowhere, he said, "Do Lubitsch. Lubitsch would be fun."
Yeah.
Because it never occurred to me. And almost literally a light bulb went on over my head. And he was right. Lubitsch was extraordinary fun.
So you work with Robert Wagner on his autobiography, Pieces of My Heart, published in 2008, and again with him on You Must Remember This, The Life and Style in Hollywood's Golden Age in 2014. Tell us about how that project, both projects really came about, and what it was like chronicling a career alongside the subject himself, contrasted with writing a straight biography.
Right. Oh, it's fascinating. It was an accident of the most benign, delightful sort. I had no way of knowing this. RJ had been thinking about writing a memoir, but he hated most of the Hollywood memoirs he read. And he happened to read my biography of Louis B. Mayer called Line of Hollywood. And he was struck by it because he knew most of the people in the book. He knew Irene Mayer Selznick. He knew L.B. Mayer's daughter. Later on, after we met, he said, what you did, he said, I recognize those people in your writing about them. And so we were just, without knowing it, we were on the same page. And it was a delightful partnership. And we've remained very good friends. We talk every week, sometimes several times a week. RJ's doing very well up in Aspen. He's now 91 and looking forward to shooting an episode of NCIS in the near future.
Wow, cool.
Great. In the Cary Grant book, you've got over literally 6 pages of bibliographic references.
Mhm.
You know, so writing a book like this or any of the other ones, especially the amount of detail you go into, has to be like detective work. So when you choose a subject from a reference perspective, do you go and try to get all of the references you can about the subject, or is it, you know, you build the outline of the book and then you go get the references as you need them?
Well, it's a slightly different process than it used to be. There are fewer people to talk to now. If you're going to be writing about people in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, there are just fewer of them are on the ground. Fewer of that generation of filmmakers and actors and actresses are on the ground. So if you're going to write about the period, it's more a question of library research than of person to person. That said, people are still writing books about the Civil War and World War II, and everybody's dead. So it's just a question of finding new material and reinterpreting that material. I mean, when I did the Lubitsch book, I probably talked to 35 or 40 people who knew Ernst Lubitsch, for instance, they were all 85 years old, 80 to 85 years old, but they were there. Were I to do that book today, I'd be down to 2 or 3, maybe. And it would become a much dry, less joyous experience, because the joy of that book and of some of the other early books was in sitting with someone and having them tell a story, which becomes a eureka moment, you know, where it's more than just a story. It actually indicates some facet of the personality. That said, I always find, even with Cary Grant, I found a fair number of people. And if I had a eureka moment on the Cary Grant, it probably came from Walt Odette. Walt can retrospectively analyze this guy that he knew. And we had a very long, very searching interview about Cary Grant and Cary Grant's close friendship with his father, Clifford Odette, because on the surface, they have nothing in common. But they were best friends, best Hollywood friends. Odette's had a group of New York friends, Lee Strasberg, Elia Kazan, that group. But in Hollywood, and Odette spent a great deal of time in Hollywood because he needed money all the time. Grant and he were very, very tight. And the bond between them essentially was that they were both primarily dissatisfied with themselves. So their dissatisfaction with themselves brought them together. But each of them had this kind of ability to stand outside themselves, look at themselves and say, no, I don't think so. Not good enough. Not good enough. But you have to ask yourself, okay, now, if there are 2 or 3 lousy books about this person, how do I avoid writing the 3rd or 4th lousy book about this person? What can I bring to the party?
What project has been the most fun for you as an author? And you said that being able to sit down with a lot of these folks who knew the subjects is really rewarding. Do you have a favorite person that you've written about, a favorite subject out of the 15, 16 books you've authored or co-authored?
Sure. Yeah, I can't tell you what's the best book I've written. I can tell you the books I most enjoyed writing.
Yeah.
The Lubitsch book and the DeMille book, by far. The Lubitsch book, because he was part of a generation like along with Billy Wilder, Robert Siodmak, William Wyler, all the Germans and the Austrians that came to Hollywood in the wake of Hitler. And they were all the people that I spent time with talking to in Hollywood. They all had this wonderful quality of being truly alive intellectually and emotionally, even though they were all very elderly. They were all in their 80s. Some of them were 80, some of them were 90. But they were all absolutely plugged in to the world around them. And that was just such a joy. Basically gave me insight into that entire generation and why their movies are so remarkable then and are so remarkable now. DeMille, for an entirely different reason. I always liked it. I think he's a great silent film director, magnificent silent film director, and truly one of the architects of Hollywood. Without DeMille, there is no Hollywood. But with every subject, there are always blank spots. There are always areas where you'd like to be able to ask them why something happened, and you can't answer that question because there's no documentation.
Right.
There's nothing there. And so you can suppose, you can when you do something like that, I always tell the reader what might have happened is this, but you can't really come down with any definitive verdict. DeMille kept everything. His father's love letters to his mothers survive. DeMille's love letters to his wife survive. He kept everything. Every scribble on a notepad was preserved because he was Cecil B. DeMille and he had this huge ego. And he realized that he was historically crucial in the history of Hollywood. Everything was kept. So there were no blank spots where I had to ask myself, why did this happen? It was just a question of finding the documentation that explained why something happened. Why DeMille left Paramount, why he went back to Paramount, why this, why that. It was all there. So I just simply had this profusion of material. It's the only time I've ever had too much material. I realized very quickly I could write 2 volumes on DeMille. No, I don't. I didn't want to write 2 volumes on DeMille, and I don't think anybody wanted to read 2 volumes. But I could have. The density of material was sufficient that I could have written 2 volumes about DeMille. And that's the only time that's ever happened. The only time it's ever happened. It was like writing about Winston Churchill, where it's all there. There are you don't have to make any educated guesses.
Well, Scott, this has been great. Before we sign off, could you give us some information about the upcoming paperback release of the Cary Grant book?
It's coming out in October. It's same thing, same format, same cover, different blurbs. From the reviews. I've got another book coming out almost at the same time simultaneously from Running Press. It's a history of Darryl Zanuck and 20th Century Fox.
Oh, cool.
It's called 20th Century Fox. The studio that Darryl Zanuck built or something along those lines. I'm kind of in the position of an air traffic controller. I have different projects like airplanes circling the port. I bring them in some rough order. So I've actually got 2 books coming out this year: the paperback of Cary Grant and the Darryl Zanuck / Fox book.
Well, I was going to ask actually one more question. Then, speaking of all the projects, do you have potentially a bucket list of projects of subjects that you'd like to tackle?
There's one book I'm kind of intellectually drawn to, but I don't know if I'd really enjoy it emotionally. But there's no good book on him, on this person. I'm not going to mention his name. There's no good book on him, and I think it's a real flaw in the literature. And I'm kind of tempted. I just don't know if I'd enjoy the process because it would take 4 years, maybe 5 years, and I don't know. I'm not sure I want to dive into that particular battlefield. No, there's but I never thought I'd write a book about Louis B. Mayer, and I had a great time writing about Louis B. Mayer. And that was another book that was suggested to me. That was not my idea. It was my editor at Simon & Schuster, who because we were sitting in his office, we were both looking out the window trying to come up with an idea, trying to come up with a book. And he swiveled in his chair and leaned over the desk and said, "Louis B. Mayer." And I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah, Louis B. Mayer." Now, the reason he said that was because he just had a successful book published, a memoir by Esther Williams. And there was, of course, a lot about Louis B. Mayer and MGM in the Esther Williams book. So he was interested in Louis B. Mayer because of this book. I didn't know if I was interested in Louis B. Mayer. But the first person I called was Lillian Ross, who wrote Picture, a wonderful book about the transition period between Mayer and Dory Sherry. And she gave me she gave me Betty Compton and A.L. Green's phone numbers and some other phone numbers. And she called Mayer a wonderful old pirate. And I thought, well, that's a wonderful old pirate's a good subject for a book.
It's a great title.
It is a great title. I may use it someday. But that was the first call I made tentatively because I wasn't at all sure I wanted to do the book. And I had a great time doing the book because he was a wonderful old pirate, So I've learned not to prejudge. I've learned not to say, oh God, no, I would never do that. There's one or two books. I'd like to write about a woman. The first book I ever wrote was about Mary Pickford, and it was the last woman I wrote about, and I'm not happy about that. I would really like to write about a woman before I hang it up, or it's hung up for me. So I'm kind of looking around for a topic, actually.
I would love to know more about Lucille Ball as a force in Hollywood. We all know her as a comedian, but as an owner of Desilu, as a force of nature that she was during that time period.
That's a good idea. And yeah, and for my friend Bob Osborne, of course, was under contract with Desilu as a young actor in the 60s. And he adored her. He would tell wonderful Lucille Ball stories. And I would listen. I haven't actually thought about Lucy. That's not a terrible idea at all. But I would like to write more about women. I think if you look at my roster of books, there's 16 books and 15 of them are about men. And I'm not really that guy. That's an accident. That's an accident of career choices, I guess. I really would like to write more about women for the remainder of my life than I have up to this point.
Well, we'd love to get you back on. I don't think there's anybody out there who knows more about a subject than an author. The book that you've written about Cary Grant is about, 500-600 pages?
Close to 6.
Close to 6. Yeah, this guy knows Cary Grant, and I can tell you personally, really enjoying the book. I've been reading the e-book version, and I have the hard copy out underneath my TV to show off to everybody. And it's just really enjoyable, really easy to read, like Greg said, and I'm envious of whoever narrated the audiobook version because it's just a breeze and a joy to read.
Thanks for the time, guys. Look forward to talking to you again.
All right, thanks.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.
Well, thank you again to our guest, Scott Eyman. You can find his latest book and the subject of today's show, Cary Grant, A Brilliant Disguise, along with the rest of Scott's impressive body of work everywhere fine books are sold. And follow him on Twitter and Facebook at ScottEyman1. So that's at ScottEyman 1. And they're all linked in the show notes, of course.
And join us next week, Friday, May 21st, when we'll welcome back to the show Tracy Gossel. Tracy is the founder of the Film Preservation Society and author of The First King of Hollywood, The Life of Douglas Fairbanks. Fairbanks was best known for his swashbuckling roles in silent films, including The Thief of Baghdad, Robin Hood, and The Mark of Zorro, and spent the early part of his career making comedies.
Along with being an accomplished actor, Fairbanks was also a screenwriter, director, producer, and a founding member of United Artists alongside wife Mary Pickford, Charlie Chaplin, and D.W. Griffith. We're looking forward to learning more about this legend of early Hollywood and his lasting impact on the film industry with Tracy, and that's coming up next Friday, May 21st.
And remember, Heilman and Haver can now be heard every week. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Amazon Audible, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Pandora. And if you enjoy the show, make sure to follow us and share the podcast with a friend.
And we'd love to hear from you, so please join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, and email us with thoughts and comments at heilmanandhaver@gmail.com. So until we're treading the boards together again, thank you for supporting local theater and for joining us here on Heilman and Haver.